Good afternoon. I'm Chris Moyer, and as we are getting close to the end of the day, wrapping up our second annual WE3 conference, we wanted to take another look at what's happening around the world. And we've had multiple conversations about the importance of sustainability, the water energy nexus, the clean energy transition, at a macro level, and often focusing on what's happening for still the most advantageous amongst us globally. But too often, when we are having these conversations, we leave out rural areas and folks that have such limited access to both clean water and energy. Renewable energy, micro clean drinking water, and sanitation projects can help provide economic opportunities and life-saving infrastructure for people in the most disadvantaged communities around the globe. To achieve true, complete water, energy, sustainable development goals set out by the United Nations, we need to make sure to engage those people the most. And to help have this conversation, I am so pleased to be joined by my friend, the Executive Director of Green Empowerment, Andrea Johnson. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us at WE3.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about this topic. As you know, it's one I'm very passionate about, and I have the privilege of working on it every day. But my background's also in energy here in the US, so I tend to take a little bit of a both and lens. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, absolutely. And you know, we've got 28 more minutes of this conversation, so don't be shy. If you have something that you want to talk about here in the United States that is of interest to you, feel free to bring that up. But you know, Zpryme is a big supporter of the work that you do at Green Empowerment. But for those people in our audience that are not as familiar, can you tell us a little bit about you and Green Empowerment's mission?
For sure. So Green Empowerment's mission is to work with local partners in their home countries to do renewable energy and clean water projects. We focus on really last mile rural communities, and part of our operating model that makes us pretty unique in our sector is that we work via local partnerships. So whether those be social enterprises, community-based groups, whatever kind of form they might take, a lot of them are indigenous-led, locally led organizations. So we work with them to meet the needs of their communities. And we really believe in this way of doing work, and that, you know, access to clean energy and water are basic human rights, and that it's an important fundamental piece of the kind of social justice equation. And for Green Empowerment, you know, we're kind of small by design. We are a small organization. A lot of folks might not have heard of us, but our impact is really throughout the globe because of our model. So we're active right now in 5 countries in Latin America, 3 and expanding into Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and also expanding right now into Uganda. And with everything going on in the world, it really feels like our values and the way we do our work is really resilient to the impacts that we're seeing of 2020. And we're really just, you know, despite everything, feeling pretty optimistic that we're going to be able to continue to deliver these critical resources to communities that need it most.
Well, thank you for sharing a little bit about that background and all the work that you do globally. What are some of the practical realities for communities that don't have access to reliable energy and clean water?
Yeah, so to put it in perspective, about 11% of the world's population does not have access to an improved water supply. So that's about 790 million people. And so I think that's really important to put into context for those of us who are so used to having a faucet that you turn on and you get that water access. So when we say improved water supply, that can be anything from just having an improved borehole well to what Green Empowerment works on, which is household level distributed water systems. So 1 in 3 people then do not have access to safe drinking water. So that's actually going beyond just the water supply, but also treated water in your home that you can safely drink. And also, while uncomfortable to talk about, one of the leading causes of death of children under 5 is actually diarrhea, a preventable symptom, not even an illness in and of itself. So that's really the reality of the kind of health and corresponding economic and social impacts of not having access to clean water. And then on the energy side, the population actually just fell, which is positive, below 1 billion people in 2018. So a little bit below 1 billion people do not have access to renewable energy. And I always ask people to just think about it in your own life. How much energy, especially in our virtual working world right now, we use in order to have economic opportunities, in order to have, maintain your food in your fridge, for example, or vaccines at the hospital. So, there's just so many ways that we interact with water and energy, and just trying to imagine yourself without that access and the challenges that would face from an economic and health perspective. And while those numbers are still terrible, like I mentioned, the number did fall below 1 billion in 2018. And there are so many positive stories out there. There are organizations like Green Empowerment and like our partners that are advancing this work in a way that is long-term sustainable. And I think where it relates a lot to the US conversation is about how distributed energy is part of the solution. And that's kind of what we've been doing in our own way globally. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted the need for this type of work to happen from the ground up as well. We can't just fly in some of these solutions. It's really about working with local communities and those that are on the ground to develop these solutions. And so that's kind of what the reality is, but there's, positive and stories and optimism as well, despite it all.
Well, I'm glad that you are highlighting some of those positive stories and that optimism. I think at the same time, it's clear that we have to balance the realities that there still are far too many people that don't have reliable access to clean water, clean energy, particularly on that clean water side, as you mentioned, that can turn deadly very, very quickly. And so it is an ongoing challenge. I would like to come back to some of those positive stories and how we can continue the advance. But before we get there, you mentioned COVID and the impact that it has had on people's lives, and it has impacted everybody's lives. But how dramatic of an impact has COVID-19 had on these communities that were already disadvantaged?
Yeah, so I think with the direct impacts, there is a lot of geographical difference. I was mentioning that Green Empowerment works in Latin America and Southeast Asia. In Peru and Ecuador, two countries where we work in, they've been two of the hardest hit countries by COVID. Lack of clean water is a huge piece of that, as well as just lack of health services and information. Interestingly, though, communities that we work primarily with in Southeast Asia have had a bit of a different approach. They've actually kind of done what we might call like self-quarantining and have actually not allowed foreigners in, and have been really regulating how people go in and out of their community. So the very direct impacts of COVID really can vary. But the problems that we're really starting to see, and we're feeling them here in the US, are really the economic impacts. How these economies that were already depressed and already having challenges have really, really slowed down. And so, much like I think the conversation here, we're really thinking about how do we help these communities through that element, and how do we also help them become more resilient to global disasters, whether they be a health pandemic, which unfortunately there are predicted to be more of those as we look at climate change, and also direct climate change impacts. So much like here, kind of how the direct impacts of COVID are impacting communities has varied quite a bit, but the related economic impacts and social impacts are just going to be felt for years to come, and access to energy and water is such a critical part of that recovery.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that difficult part, because there will come a time, particularly in the Western world, I'm in the United States, in Europe, and where the impacts of COVID diminish pretty quickly, and then people will kind of just get back to life as normal. But the economic fallout and toil for so many people around the globe, as you mentioned, will be felt for years. What are some of the ways that Green Empowerment and other organizations can keep those challenges and struggle at the top of people's minds to help make sure that we are providing the economic avenues for growth and success in a sustainable fashion for these communities.
Yeah, I guess I would first say, like, shameless plug for Zpryme, creating spaces to even talk about this in a way is important in terms of keeping it top of mind, and thinking about renewable energy, clean water, the nexus of that and economic impacts is part of it. Just keeping that story and conversation going um, is such an important part of it. And then, for an organization like Green Empowerment, we're a relatively small NGO. But we've been able to advance community water systems and energy access for health clinics despite the challenges of this year, right? And so I do see kind of the collective action of organizations like Green Empowerment and those that we might partner with as just part of having to continue to make that advancement. And in general, partnerships is such a key piece of it. So whether those be public-private partnerships, breaking down silos across sectors, when we're starting to talk about energy access at health clinics, when you go talk to folks that manage health facilities in these remote rural areas, they aren't energy experts, right? And so I do think part of that is making sure that we're creating the opportunities to work across what we might know and share our expertise, and then focusing on the types of projects that are going to have that real impact. So just as an example with Green Empowerment, we just completed a handful of water projects in Latin America. These are community scale access where they're actually bringing potable drinking water to people's homes. We have another 10 communities that we're working with, and we are going to complete another 18 next year. And so while those numbers don't really move the percentage when you're looking at 790 million people, for each of those communities, that's a huge impact in their ability to be resilient and start to make some of those improvements.
Well, I'm glad that you started to talk about some of the specific projects. We have a great question in the chat from Benjamin, and he asked what resources are being provided in some of these communities, and that also dovetails into an opportunity for you to maybe chat about some of the projects that you are proudest of in regards to green empowerment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So from Green Empowerment's perspective, we like to say that we're a bit technology agnostic. So when we're thinking about a water resource, it's really about doing a feasibility study about what are the water resources available in a community, what are the energy resources, and how those two things often intersect. So if there is electricity access that's reliable in a community, what type of water pump might be appropriate, what type of water treatment is appropriate, and what's the distribution look like. Whereas some communities that we're working with, gravity-fed systems actually work quite well. We can work with communities to protect that water source and do some watershed protection. And so when we're thinking about what resources are available, there's very much that first focus on what is the kind of natural local resources available, and then what technology is available. One thing Green Empowerment focuses on is participating in local supply chains. So part of that is in an interest to engage with the economic activity locally, but also to make sure these systems are sustained over time. So it might not always be the highest tech thing that could be available here, but if people are going to be able to fix it and maintain it over time locally, the impact will be greater. So that's how we start thinking about resources, both the natural resources, the community resources, is the municipality involved? And then primarily we're working with micro hydro mini grids in Southeast Asia, as well as solar, micro hydro hybrids, solar, and then some rooftop solar. And then when we're thinking about water and energy for community services, specifically health clinics, a lot of that is moving towards energy with storage. And just some of the advancements that we're seeing with the cost of renewable energy, globally, it's really allowing for kind of quicker deployment and more scaling, and the prevalence of those technologies make the solutions more readily available. So that's really specific to how we think about the different resources and how it's pretty exciting. The advancements that we're making in renewable energy and solar with storage are really going to have benefits for these communities as well. And we're starting to really see that. One project I just thought, what relates to your question about what we're really proud of right now, we're currently looking at 57 health clinics in rural Uganda. So Green Empowerment's been working to electrify health clinics in Peru and Myanmar since about 2004 and 2006 respectively, often working in really rural areas with displaced populations or even refugee settlements. And the Ministry of Health in Peru recently adopted our model, of doing solar for these rural health clinics and training actually health technicians to maintain those. And so we've been thinking quite a bit about how can you bring in technology innovation with kind of ground up solutions. And so our team actually developed a mobile data collection app. It can be used offline to collect health facility data in a non-technical way. So any of us, myself, I'm not technical, full disclosure. So I could go to a health facility, enter the data, and we could start to look at a picture of what the energy needs might be. And if you were to invest in additional equipment for that facility, what your energy needs might be in the future. So we've actually deployed this app for 57 health clinics in Uganda. And we are going to be working with the organizational partners, Medical Teams International, to try to integrate renewable energy and deploy it kind of into their systems to improve health, health delivery, as well as kind of facility management. So for us right now, we're feeling really excited about that because it takes a lot of our experience of working with these local organizations on the ground, but kind of overlays this technology innovation and the power of data-driven decisions to bring these solutions. And ideally, that energy will be installed by local installers, local practitioners who are part of the renewable energy sector in Uganda. So it just kind of feels like a great example right now that we're feeling very excited about, that combines a lot of the things that, our values, what we believe in, and the kind of ability of integrating technology innovation into that.
Well, it really is the empowerment part, because instead of it being a large multinational corporation coming in, and I'm not trying to say that in a completely negative light, development is often very positive. But when you empower folks that live in these communities to take full advantage of the abundance of resources in the sustainable fashion that they might have, it keeps that economic prosperity in the community, which is so important and critical for long-term sustainable growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're kind of speaking our language there too, because what we are hoping to kind of promote is that we try to marry these things. So you can have those multinationals, you can have interesting conversations about impact investing and technology innovation. You can think about governments and business and NGOs, but how do we bring those things together to really have that impact that we want to have? And I see it starting to happen. I know that there are conversations at really high levels that an organization like Green Empowerment kind of observes from the outside. And I think that there's some really interesting conversations happening with, indigenous rights, conversations around anti-colonialism in our sector that I think, while challenging conversations, to your point, I think it's important, and we're starting to get there. And some of the conversations that have been happening in the US around social justice and racial justice are influential there, right? I think it's going to help us really reflect on the best way to do this work in a way that does lead to the impacts we all want to achieve. And those are shared goals.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that. There is certainly a racial justice and social justice and environmental justice element to this. And I would say that there's still room to go, ways to go for multinationals on this, but this isn't the environment of multinationals in the 1970s and 80s coming in. There has been significant improvement in that regard, partially because they're listening to organizations like yours, like Green Empowerment, like folks on the ground that are living in these communities. Great question from Benjamin. We have another great question from the audience. Clay asks, do you have a list of attributes a community must have for you to initiate a project? And he frames this in the idea that some areas might be subject to political instability, and how that might impede your work.
That is a really great question. So Green Empowerment actually flips that question on its head a little bit. So we like to say that we come at the invitation of our partners, and that our partners are invited in by communities. And so we aren't going around and selecting communities for which to work with. That said, in terms of being able to actually implement a project that has the impact that you want to have and will be sustained over time, you really have to take into consideration a lot of those factors. And the real beauty of the partnership model is that it doesn't require somebody like me, who doesn't have experience living in all these communities, to understand the complexity of some of those political and social implications. But we have had instances where we advance a project. There's a lot of soft skills and community organizing that our partners really lead on. And they are so impressive because they understand some of those dynamics, some of the history. But we've had projects where it gets to a certain point, you feel like there's community consensus. Oftentimes the communities themselves have some type of agreement with the project, and there's an official turnover of the project to the community. And we've had instances where we've gotten that far and put in that much work, but often because of resource disputes, especially land ownership becomes a real issue in a lot of communities we're working with, especially when it comes to different pressures on the natural environments, such as like logging or mining. We've had to push pause on projects. Luckily, I think what that does though is it kind of puts that onus on the community to make sure that they're really committed to the project, and to our local partner who's going to be the one that is kind of leading the charge to make sure it happens. So that's how we kind of flip that question on its head and really take the lead from our partner organization. We as an organization also have chosen not to we don't give any funding directly to governments. So that's kind of part of our operating model. So we collaborate with local governments. Oftentimes local municipalities will provide transportation or different materials support, but we do not provide funding to local governments directly, even when they're collaborators on the project. And that's just a way, to protect the kind of limited and valuable resources that green empowerment has, because it really is outside of our scope to be able to monitor some of the potential corruption or misuse of funds that could come in those scenarios. And so we do make sure those resources go directly to partners and communities and not governments, which I do think is a great example of a role for some of those multilaterals, right? That's who can kind of manage some of those complicated funding streams.
Well, it's almost like you anticipated my next follow-up question to that, which I want to circle back to some of the positive news that you mentioned. Now we are headed in the right direction of people having access to energy. There is some progress with access to clean water. How can governments, businesses, and NGOs do more to continue to positively change those living standards globally?
Yeah, I think that's a really big question. And I am not the most expert on some of it because, unfortunately, a lot of this reality relates to like global trade agreements and how those are implemented, and different, debt agreements that we put on governments. But when it comes
You are being
to
very humble. I recognize that you are not the incoming Secretary of State, but I'll stop there and I won't interrupt you.
well, thank you. But I do feel like that's where you are starting to see, with USAID, right? The United States International Development Agency, they are highlighting partnerships. They are focusing on trying to figure out, how do you have public-private partnerships? How do you have cross-sector relationships? And so I do see some real positives on that side of things. And when it comes to, with the example of the work in Uganda, what's been really interesting is, there is some probably quite accurate news about Uganda's government being corrupt. What you find though is, like, when you are working with local folks that are representing, say, the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of Health, they're there doing their work and are willing to collaborate. And so I think it's also finding the right kind of actors within each of these different entities to maybe break down some of the barriers about collaboration and just be able to move forward towards common goals. So you're seeing some real positive stuff come out of it. And honestly, with COVID, it's been interesting. There's been this heightened attention on energy and water access. And so I do think that that's one of the ways the pandemic is actually spurring some additional investment in these really critical areas.
Let's approach that question slightly differently. As you were so humble, but did give us a good answer about how governments and interagency process can work. What are some of those projects that Green Empowerment is hoping to work on and achieve over the next few months and years that will make an impact on people's lives?
Yeah, so we kind of have a bit of a two-pronged approach going on. We have communities that we are currently working with that we are working to do clean water projects and energy access projects. I think these, we've already talked about how those are such critical resource needs. We have 18 communities that we're looking to collaborate with next year on water access just in Latin America as an important data point. And so in addition to those just like core elements of working with partners to do the work, we have a few pretty exciting, I would call them more on the tech innovation side of things, about how do we continuously improve how we're doing that community scale management. So one of those projects that we're really excited about is a Smart Grid for Small Grids program. This is an open source initiative. We've already developed an electronic load controller for micro hydro projects that's open source, has Bluetooth connectivity, and have trained 11 practitioners throughout Southeast Asia to build, design, and deploy their own electronic load controllers. These are helpful for demand or production side management of the micro hydro systems. And so we're taking that a step further, and we're actually looking at same kind of conversation you're hearing in the US around smart grids, but how do you apply those to really, really small, pretty vulnerable grids? So how can we help these systems be more reliable? We're talking about, say, 20, 50 households. So if you want to also incorporate, say, a rice mill because of productive end use and economic opportunities, what's that going to do to the grid? And how could we also have the same type of smart grid management that we're thinking about here in the US and on these distributed energy systems? So that's pretty exciting. We just got some good funding for it and hit an important milestone. And we're going to see that work really picking up and doing some test sites next year. And then I mentioned the health clinics work. That's part of our expansion into Uganda. So this is building off the work with Medical Teams International to electrify their health clinics. And we just are starting to see how much access to information for these decision makers who actually manage the health facilities or health programs is going to help scale the deployment of renewable energy. So green empowerment is not going to be the installer on those projects, but helping people that actually need the energy to improve their health services or their community services understand that is going to really help that kind of local market accelerate the adoption of clean energy. So that's two things that we're pretty excited about in addition to just the core work of what we do. And, we're well positioned for growth. I have a little bit of a, I guess you'd almost call it survivor's guilt right now. Small nonprofits are kind of struggling within 2020, but green empowerment's really well positioned for growth. And we see that growth to be distributed, just like our energy and water projects, right? That growth will happen by working with more partners, working with more communities, and kind of expanding our impact that way. So we're actually feeling pretty optimistic about 2021 with the asterisks of despite everything else going on.
Wow, and that is a big asterisk. And despite everything else that is going on, it is so good to hear that that there is support for the incredible work that you do. But that leads me to my last question. How can people get involved and support your work even more?
Well, first and shamelessly is to donate. We are a small nonprofit. And, it's also not just about green empowerment in general. The work that a lot of these small nonprofits do here in the US and globally is just critical to getting through the challenges of this year. And like we talked about, kind of helping communities rebuild and hopefully rebuild smarter and more sustainably and more resilient. And then just connecting on social media, LinkedIn, share our story. And the bigger picture for me that Chris, that we talked about is in all of us can integrate equity and justice into the work we do. No matter where you fit in an organization or community, that is kind of part of it. So by honoring that, that's part of Green Empowerment's core values. And if folks do that, I think it does support our work because it helps the global conversation around resource management, around development, around energy and clean water.
What a beautiful note to end this conversation on. We all have an opportunity to weave a positive fabric of society. So thank you, Andrea, for joining us. And I will say this, thank you for joining us on your birthday. Happy birthday to you. It is it's always such a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for taking the time to spend to spend a half hour with WE3 conference and Zpryme. We really appreciate it. It's
my pleasure, and I wish the world was different so we'd be sharing cake or an adult beverage, but
yeah, absolutely. But there will be another time. There will be a time for that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and again, thanks for organizing the conference. It's been really interesting.
We've had a great time doing that, and we have one more exciting session to go. And I am so excited for this one. It is one on virtual reality, augmented reality, and that will start in just about 10 minutes. So stick around for that. We'll have that session, and then I'll come back and close everything out. But thank you, everyone, for tuning into this conversation about expanding global access to sustainable water and energy.